My name is William Cooper. Between the years 1970 and 1973, I served on the intelligence briefing team of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, who at that time was Admiral Bernard Cleary. I was attached to the Office of Naval Intelligence. I had a top secret, Q, sensitive compartmentalized information, security clearance, and actually had access and the need to know almost everything that the Admiral himself, the members of his staff, and many high-level government officials. It was during this time that during the routine course of my duties, top-secret documents crossed my desk that I was able to read that outlined everything that really and truthfully happened, according to those documents, in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. According to these top-secret documents, the intelligence community and the national security apparatus considered John F. Kennedy to be a threat to the national security. It did not explain what this meant. It stated also that he had ordered the security establishment to prepare a plan to reveal to the American people within the following year the truth about unidentified flying objects.
So if you've seen my video on Robert Booth Nicholls, or the Netflix series American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, then hopefully you remember the scene where the journalist, Sherry Seymour, is at a meeting with Robert Booth Nicholls, asking him about his relationship with Danny Casolaro, when suddenly Nicholls brings out a projector and plays for Seymour what he implies is the real version of the Zapruder film. The video starts out as normal, with Kennedy being driven through Dealey Plaza, but suddenly the driver of the presidential limo, a Secret Service agent named William Greer, turns around in his seat, points a gun at Kennedy's head, and delivers the fatal shot before driving off with Jackie Kennedy panicking in the back seat. Nicholls tells Seymour that the Zapruder film distributed to the media was just a fake, doctored by the assassination's plotters to conceal Greer's involvement in the crime. The CIA can cover up anything it wants, even a president's murder, Nicholls says. Robert Booth Nicholls, the money launderer, arms manufacturer, and alleged spy with connections to both organized crime and American intelligence, had been an important source for the journalist Danny Casolaro during his investigation of the web of corruption he called the Octopus. After Casolaro's death, Sherry Seymour started retracing his steps, chasing down the various leads Casolaro had been pursuing before his supposed suicide in a West Virginia hotel room. This screening of the alternate Zapruder tape at Nicholls' apartment in 1992 would ultimately become a central plot point in both Seymour's 2010 book on the Octopus, The Last Circle, and the 2024 Netflix documentary series, American Conspiracy, where the story's framed as a peek behind the curtain into Nicholls' life as a keeper of the secrets of the Black Ops world. But as we saw from his associations with people like Ted Gunderson and Sam Israel, Nicholls was also something of a conspiracy theorist and a con man. And as we unravel the bizarre story of how this alternate Zapruder tape came to be, and how it was used and misused by some of the most consequential figures of late 20th century conspiracy mythology, we may be able to finally put to rest one of the most intriguing mysteries of the entire Octopus saga. So, the meeting during which Robert Booth Nicholls showed the alternate Zapruder tape to Sherry Seymour took place in February of 1992. But to really understand what was going on, we have to talk about American conspiracy culture of the 1980s. Today, in 2026, if you're interested in deep politics, one of the biggest problems you'll confront is the absolute overabundance of conspiracy material that the average person doesn't have the time or inclination to actually sort through. But in the 1980s, before the widespread adoption of the internet and access to the tools of media creation, they had the opposite problem. Besides the occasional TV special on UFOs or magazine article about the JFK assassination, conspiracy material was distributed primarily on physical copies, in real life, within the context of a niche, insular subculture. During this period, the conspiracy scene was dominated by a loose network of organizations, nonprofits, and publishers, which by the late 80s had come to resemble something like an alternative media ecosystem/social network. There were old stalwarts like the anti-communist John Birch Society, There was the Christic Institute, led by Daniel Sheehan, which was directly involved in everything from the Karen Silkwood case to Iran-Contra and UFO disclosure. There were JFK assassination truthers forming factions around Mark Lane, Jim Garrison, and many others. There was Lyndon LaRouche's National Caucus of Labor Committees and Executive Intelligence Review, the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON. There were white supremacists and right-wing militiamen warning about Zog or the New World Order, Christian evangelicals worried about Satanist infiltration, and the journalists and ex-intelligence officers publishing their research in outlets like Covert Action Information Bulletin, Steam Shovel Press, and Lobster Magazine. In this pre-internet era, information was shared through newsletters, zines, VHS tape trading circles, and conferences like the regional MUFON symposia. These groups were, for the most part, at least nominally pretty siloed off from each other. But in reality, they often shared both audiences and, ultimately, sources of information, leading to bizarre new combinations of conspiracy theories. For example, at gun shows, especially in the Midwest, it wasn't uncommon to see representatives from the John Birch Society, anti-New World Order militia outfits, and Christian identity groups manning booths and passing out literature. Famously, Timothy McVeigh spent considerable time during the lead-up to the Oklahoma City bombing immersed in this kind of environment, attending gun shows under the name Tim Tuttle, selling conspiracy-related media and warning others of black helicopters, while living at the Christian Identity compound, Elohim City. Danny Casallero's Octopus is, in many ways, for better or worse, also a synthesis of this swirling vortex of conspiracy theories. He was undeniably getting information from some credible sources, but Casallero's notes indicate he was also chasing down leads about UFOs, the Majestic 12 hoax documents, and even the Illuminati, based on tips he received from sources like the Christic Institute and Ted Gunderson. But to get to the root of this mystery, we have to examine one particular branch of the conspiracy scene with which Casallero and Robert Booth Nicholls were known to have interacted. As mentioned in the first Nicholls video, John Lear was the son of the industrialist and aviation magnate who created the Learjet, Bill Lear. Despite his elite pedigree and privileged upbringing, by the 1980s, John Lear had been disinherited by his father and was living a fairly modest life in Las Vegas after retiring from a career as a pilot for the CIA and private industry. By the late 1980s, Lear had become an avid, credulous consumer of UFO media, eagerly detailing his elaborate conspiracy theories in interviews with local radio and TV journalists like George Knapp, and posting about his beliefs on BBS message boards about the paranormal. Perhaps because of his famous last name, or just his social connections, Lear quickly assumed a prominent position in the ufology world, viewed by many in the subculture as an authority on the subject, and at least to some extent, an insider. And with this newfound notoriety, a group began to form around John Lear, which ultimately became one of the most famous or infamous factions within this conspiracy ecosystem. A lot of the names you hear regarding Bob Lazar and Area 51 conspiracy theories can be directly traced to the group of people around John Lear at this time. For example, Lear first went public with his UFO beliefs in 1987. Just months later, in 1988, Lear meets Bob Lazar for the first time through their mutual friend, Gene Huff, when Huff comes to Lear's house to appraise it for a planned second mortgage, and brings Lazar with him to, quote, hold the tape measure. This is John Lear's account of his first meeting with Bob Lazar.
And the possibility that saucers were up there. You put out this paper at the end of December of 1987, and then lo and behold, poof, along comes a guy who seems to confirm your worst fears or your wildest suspicions, that guy being Bob Lazar. And a lot of folks think, well, that's just too darn convenient.
It was extremely weird. What happened, as you remember, in the spring of 1988, I was on my soapbox because at that time I didn't believe the military knew about this, and I wanted to tell. Well, I guess I did. I wanted to tell the public about it. So I gave that lecture at the Spring Valley Library. I think 2 weeks in a row there, and I got a call in like June or July from Gene Huff, and Gene says, "Hey, listen, I'm interested in your stuff, and I'd like to get a copy of your tapes and stuff like that." Well, but that was one of the times I had withdrawn. And I was getting so many calls, and it was just so overwhelming. I said, look, I'm out of it. I'm not going to have anything to do with it, and, goodbye. And he said, well, okay, if you ever change your mind, he says, I'm a real estate appraiser. and I'll trade you an appraisal for your tapes. Well, that meant something to me because I needed a loan and I needed a second mortgage on my house. I said, okay, look, you do that and I'll give you everything I have. So I started copying all my stuff and got it all ready from him. And we made a appointment. He comes over with this guy and he says, I have my helper here. We're going to measure your house. And we start talking. Turns out this guy's name is Bob Lazar. So as Gene and I are talking about saucers and Billy Myers and MJ12 and all this stuff, this guy is rolling his eyes, and he can't make it plain enough that he thinks we're absolutely nuts. And so Gene says, look, this guy worked at Los Alamos National Labs. He's a scientist. He was a scientist there. He thinks we're nuts because he said if there was anything there that he would have known about it. And then Bob says, yeah, look, he said, I had the highest clearance. He said, I was the nosiest. I poked around everywhere. He said, if there was anything to this, I would have known about it. Didn't we hear that from Ned Day? So anyway, that was like in the June or July of '88. Over the next 3 or 4 months, we started giving Bob Lazar information, and he was receptive. He said, okay, well, I'll look at it. And one or two, I think there was 3 things that really tipped him over. And one was the YY-2 secret address that we had at Los Alamos, and the fact that we knew about it and he didn't. And the other was, I forget what the 3 things, the grudge reports, he did find those that were not supposed to exist. And there was a third one, I forget what it was.
So according to John Lear, he was already so well known for promoting UFO conspiracy theories that people were calling him, asking for material on UFOs, when Gene Huff coincidentally shows up at his house with Bob Lazar, who, despite supposedly being an MIT-educated physicist at the time, was working as a photo lab tech and real estate appraiser's sidekick. Then, after weeks or months of feeding Lazar information about UFO conspiracy theories, Bob suddenly announces he's been studying alien spaceships at Area 51 using his advanced MIT physics knowledge. John Lear, apparently thinking this sounds totally credible, introduces Bob Lazar to local Las Vegas journalist George Knapp, who airs the first ever media interview with Lazar just months later in 1989, kicking off Bob's now 30-something-year-long UFO career. And this is a pattern you're going to notice with many of the figures surrounding John Lear from this period. They would be exposed to some conspiracy theory for the first time, then within a few weeks or months, they'd start inserting themselves into the story, claiming to have special insider knowledge regarding the conspiracy. One of the other figures orbiting John Lear during this period who fits this description was the author and radio host Bill Cooper. Cooper had been an officer in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam era and later had a brief career in naval intelligence. But by the late 80s, Cooper had started publicly claiming that he'd received classified briefings in the early 70s, proving direct government involvement in a vast array of criminal conspiracies, from CIA drug trafficking to the secret world government and treaties with alien civilizations, themes which he would later expand upon in his book, Behold a Pale Horse, which was Cooper's attempt at a sort of unified field theory of New World Order and UFO conspiracy theories. It's beyond the scope of this video to examine Cooper's claims in detail, but various researchers have thoroughly documented significant inconsistencies in Cooper's stories. In different tellings over years, he changed the year that he claimed these top-secret briefings occurred, sometimes saying they happened in 1971, 72, or 73. He would randomly add new disclosures to the list of secrets he'd purportedly received during the briefings, and omit others he'd previously claimed were included. He was even caught plagiarizing the work of other UFO researchers, taking information from their publications and claiming he'd received it decades earlier during the supposed briefings. Cooper and John Lear apparently became acquainted through their posts on a BBS forum called Paranet, and at least initially, Cooper's conspiracy output focused primarily on the UFO topic and John Birch Society-style New World Order narratives. But if you've been watching this channel, then hopefully you're aware that thanks to a comment left by channel member William Patterson 1376, I was able to track down a video of Bill Cooper exhibiting what appeared to be a copy of Robert Booth Nicholls' alternate Zapruder film on a local TV station in Salt Lake City in 1991, the year before Nicholls showed the same video to Sherry Seymour. In fact, Cooper had been showing the film publicly for at least a couple years by that point, and even started claiming that information about the limo driver's involvement in the JFK assassination had been included in those supposed classified briefings he'd received way back in the early 70s.
The film that you normally view when they show it to you on television is speeded up many times so that everything happens real fast. You're always looking at Kennedy. You don't even detect that the car slows down, and you never look at the driver, so you wouldn't see it anyway. But just to take a precaution, they cut a few clips out there, so even if you did think to look at the driver, you still wouldn't see it. But in the film I'm going to show you tonight, we got those clips. Now, when I saw those documents, it said in the documents that the act was plainly visible in the film that was withheld from the public. We do know that the passenger, Secret Service agent by the name of Kellerman, I call him Killerman, during the motorcade, when you blow the frames up, you can see him watching Kennedy through his rearview mirror on the right hand outside of the car. You can see it clearly. He's sitting there and his eyes are watching Kennedy in that rearview mirror the whole time. When Kennedy is struck in the throat, he watches for a few more seconds, then he turns around, he verifies it, he turns back to the front, he passes something to the driver, who is William Greer. They seem to converse for a second. He then goes back to his position. William Greer then glances. Then Kellerman leans over, takes the wheel. William Greer pulls, with his left hand, pulls up, and you can see it clearly. He pulls up a pistol, turns, and over his right shoulder, shoots Kennedy directly in the head. Kennedy's head then snaps backward. Jacqueline Kennedy looks at her husband. You can see her eyes go from her husband and look directly at William Greer, and then she attempts to get out of the car.
But that still didn't answer the question of where, how, and why this alternate Zapruder tape was produced. The alterations appear to have been professionally done, in a way that would be virtually undetectable to an untrained observer, and yet the video must have been created in the late 80s or early 90s at the latest, when the technology to make such edits was costly, highly technical, and rare. So who would have the money, means, and motivation to even create such a fake in the first place? And how did it end up in Bill Cooper's possession? So, as we've already discussed, Cooper was part of this faction orbiting John Lear within the larger conspiracy scene of the late 1980s. But at the same time, there were countless other, lesser-known players floating around this ecosystem, working on media projects, building alliances, and just as often engaging in vicious infighting. In the section of my Robert Booth Nicholls video detailing Nicholls' association with the ex-FBI agent and private investigator Ted Gunderson, I briefly mentioned an interview on that topic that Ken Thomas had conducted with a man named Lars Hansen, which had been published in Steam Shovel Press, and it turns out that Hansen was one of these marginal figures in the conspiracy milieu of the period. Although he's usually identified as a journalist or researcher in the handful of media reports covering his activities, Larson seems to have been essentially a freelance writer and video editor who picked up occasional work in JFK assassination and POW MIA-related activist circles. In case it isn't clear by now, the conspiracy scene of the 1980s was highly dysfunctional and socially toxic. Many of the players were knowingly dishonest, willing to exaggerate and outright lie for the sake of creating hype or appearing to have inside information. Accusations of research stealing were common and not always misplaced, since there really were dishonest actors in the field like Bill Cooper, who might plagiarize your work and take credit for it. Apparently, conspiracy theories weren't that lucrative back then either, because there were constant feuds between different factions and individuals accusing each other of rip-offs, fraud schemes, and leaving debts unpaid. And because the conspiracy scene was inherently so distrustful and paranoid, these disagreements would constantly devolve into mindless Fed-jacketing. And these disputes often played out in public, posted on the personal websites or message boards of one faction or another, some of which are actually still online to this day. And there's one such document titled UFOs, Aliens, and Ex-Intelligence Agents, Who's Fooling Whom, also known as the Hansen affidavit, which is highly relevant to the subject of this video. It appears to have originally been published in 1991, but it's still accessible on the website of a man named Ken Rom. Hansen apparently composed the document after a falling out with Bill Cooper and John Lear, when Cooper started publicly accusing Hansen of being some kind of intelligence agent. Hansen wrote the affidavit to refute the allegation and to detail the litany of dishonest and unethical actions he says he witnessed from Cooper and Lear. The text is long, rambling, and repetitive, but it does contain some fascinating insights into the group surrounding John Lear and Bob Lazar in the early 90s. I'm going to have to exclude most of it for time, but I'll leave a link to the affidavit in the description of the video. Hansen says that before their falling out in 1989, Lear had been talking up the imminent threat of gray aliens from Zeta Reticuli, who Lear believed were hiding in underground bases in the Nevada desert, waiting for the right time to take over the world. He says that after the blow-up with John Lear, Bob Lazar told him that Lear had become, quote, obsessed with seeing Hansen killed, openly discussing means by which he could lure Hansen to his home to provoke an incident, and was even carving Hansen's name into bullets. Hansen also claims Bob Lazar told him that, during Bob's supposed super-secret classified briefing at Area 51 detailing the history of the U.S. government's alien contact, Lazar had been shown documents proving that the AIDS virus had been engineered as a biological weapon by the American government. But the cabal had also created an antidote for the virus, and showed Lazar the formula for it, which he memorized during the briefing. Remember, at this time, Lars Hansen is a freelance video editor, writer, and researcher who's kind of a marginal figure in several of these factions within the conspiracy world. Shortly before he met John Lear, Hansen had been working on other conspiracy media projects, like a video for one of Bo Greitz's political campaigns. But Hansen also had a long-standing interest in the JFK assassination and occasionally took on side projects related to the issue. It turns out that in 1986, Hansen had met two JFK researchers named Perry Adams and David Evans, who had spent the preceding years working on a theory that William Greer, the limo driver, had fired the fatal shot into Kennedy's head in Dealey Plaza. Adams and Evans had amassed a sizable body of evidence which they claimed supported their theory, and after meeting Hansen, they asked him to help enhance the Zapruder tape to enable more precise analysis. The product of this arrangement was a short video titled The Truth Betrayed, Dallas Revisited, which Hansen says he created in 1988 at a studio in Santa Barbara, California, some 3 months before he met John Lear. To produce the video, Hansen took his copy of the Zapruder tape, already at least a third or fourth generation reprinting, reduced it to black and white, and manually increased the contrast over several iterations, such that the final product was a 7th generation copy of the original Zapruder film. According to Hansen, the whole process took about 45 minutes.
In this film you're going to see, this film narrated by a man named Lars Hansen, the film that he claims that he prepared and discovered. We really haven't gotten to the bottom of that yet. You're going to see this act, but this is a poor film. Watch closely. Keep your eyes on the driver.
What we're observing here is the motorcade in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. As the presidential car passes behind the freeway sign, President Kennedy is struck in the throat by a bullet that was fired from the grassy knoll. As he's grasping his throat, John Connolly is turning around to his right. He at that point is struck. You notice the the passenger of the car turning back to see what has happened to the president. As he turns back to the front, the driver of the car turns with his left arm over his right shoulder with a pistol and fires. You see the 45 caliber nickel-plated automatic weapon in his left hand. He's firing over his right shoulder. You see it in relief. You see his head pointing backwards towards the president.
In his affidavit, Hansen says the tape was produced as a sort of proof of concept that he could show to potential investors so that they might fund a more thorough investigation using a clearer copy and better methods. But as you may have noticed, this version of The Truth Betrayed is in black and white, in extremely low resolution, while everyone who saw Nicholls' version said that it was a very clear copy and in full color. So what happened? Well, according to Hansen, after meeting John Lear a few months later and describing his JFK research and the video, Lear obtained a copy of The Truth Betrayed from the Santa Barbara production house where the video was made and started privately exhibiting it to his house guests without explaining its true origins. In his affidavit, Hansen stresses that the film was never intended for public viewing and was created solely to demonstrate what might be discovered if the Zapruder film was analyzed using more advanced methods. In fact, over the following months, Hansen consulted several Zapruder film experts who unanimously agreed that the white blotch Hansen had identified as a gun was in fact a reflection of sunlight from the head of the other Secret Service agent in the limo, Roy Kellerman.
His name is Lars Hansen. 2 years ago, he produced a videotape which has rocked the assassination research community ever since.
Kennedy's been shot in the throat. He's leaning to his left. The driver now begins to rotate. His left arm comes over his right shoulder, and he fires now. Again, you see the driver rotate. You see the weapon come into view. He's rotating again. The weapon is in view. He fires. You can clearly see his head turning and his arm and the weapon extending into view over his right shoulder. For a highly trained marksman, it would not have been obviously that difficult a shot, and especially if he was trained as a quick draw artist to make the maneuver quickly, he easily could have just turned around like this and fired right over there.
It's not a gun. It's a man's head.
Robert Groden is generally acknowledged as the world's leading expert on the assassination's photographic evidence. He is co-author of High Treason, in which he offers evidence that the Kennedy autopsy photos were altered to cover up a conspiracy. Utilizing his own copy and state-of-the-art enlargements of the assassination film, Groden contends that what appears to be a .45 caliber nickel-plated automatic in the hands of Agent Greer is merely a reflection.
This is what they are contending is the gun.
Right. Here's the reflection of the shadow, the bottom of the shadow, on the top of the forehead. This is light reflected sunlight off the forehead. This is the top of Kellerman's head. This is the top of Greer's head. Here's Greer's ear.
So you don't buy this chauffeur, Secret Service agent turning around and firing a gun at Kennedy?
No way in the world. It's pure disinformation. It's got to be disinformation. No one in their right mind could believe that.
It was a very rushed job. We never intended to sell this. We never intended to distribute it. So we weren't concerned with that aspect of it, but rather just being able to clearly see the movements of the principal people involved in the limousine.
There were a dozen people within 20 feet of the car at that point. They've all testified what they saw. They all say the shots came from the front, but none of them said that Greer fired the shot. It's ridiculous. I can't believe that anybody in their right mind would believe this story, but they're promoting it. So they're either doing it for personal gain, or they're doing it for the purpose of disinformation.
Hansen says he told John Lear that the video was misleading and insisted that it shouldn't be spread any further, but Lear continued showing the tape at public events and for visitors to his house. One of these visitors was Bill Cooper. Within a few months, Cooper began showing the film to audiences at his lectures, including an event outside a 1989 MUFON conference in Las Vegas, and even began selling copies of the video with his own name printed on them. Hansen says that when he first met Bill Cooper, the man had little interest in the JFK assassination and appeared to be totally unfamiliar with even the basic facts of the case. Once he discovered that Cooper had been publicly misrepresenting the tape's provenance, Hansen demanded that he stop using the video completely and even started showing up at Cooper's events to voice his objections. What's clear from multiple sources is that at some point after Cooper had begun exhibiting the tape publicly, someone in John Lear's circle sent a copy of the video to the Japanese TV station Nippon TV, which colorized the film and appears to have taken a few creative liberties with the editing, including adding gunshot sound effects and making the quote-unquote gun a different color than Kellerman's head and other reflective objects. This is almost certainly the same version of the video that Nicholls showed to Sherry Seymour with the sound removed. I couldn't pin down exactly when the Nippon colorization took place, but according to Hansen's affidavit, it must have occurred before August 1990, because Cooper had begun showing the colorized version by that time at the latest. Cooper claimed that he was the one who sent the tape to Nippon TV, ostensibly for computer enhancement, but Hansen claimed the Nippon producers told him they'd actually gotten their copy from John Lear. Multiple contemporaneous reports suggest that Lear was facing significant financial problems at the time, and I suspect what really happened was that Lear sold his copy of The Truth Betrayed to Nippon, and they added the colorization to make the reflection off of Kellerman's head look more like a gun. Nicholls' presentation to Sherry Seymour occurred in February of 1992, meaning the colorized version of The Truth Betrayed predated this meeting by at least 17 months. And Nicholls was acquainted with multiple people in the John Lear group, including, at the very least, Ted Gunderson and Lear himself, so it would have been trivially easy for him to obtain a copy of this video by 1992. Even though I couldn't pin down exact dates, it's likely that Cooper was even selling copies of the colorized version by this point, meaning that the film Nicholls showed Sherry Seymour as proof of his insider status was likely commercially available to the general public at the time she saw it. Now, a skeptic looking at this evidence could point out that our ultimate source for much of this information is just a text document buried on some ancient website and attributed to Lars Hansen. So to accept it as valid testimony means assuming that A, it really was written by Hansen and not just made up retrospectively by Ken Rom or someone else, and B, that Hansen was telling the truth. And these are entirely rational objections. But there are other pieces of evidence that I think tip the scales towards the Hansen affidavit being legit. The first comes from the ufologist, writer, and podcaster Don Ecker. In the mid to late 80s, Ecker was the research director for one of the biggest UFO publications in the United States, UFO Magazine, and was highly, personally familiar with the crew around John Lear at the time. Around 2007, Ecker published a document titled 20 Years in the UFO Fog about various misadventures and disinformation he'd encountered during his UFO career, and one of the sections concerns the Truth Betrayed video. Ecker seems to have known most of the players involved, and says that Hansen originally approached John Lear with the tape hoping to raise money for the project. Ecker claims he heard Lear say that Cooper never mentioned anything about William Greer or the existence of an alternate Zapruder film until Lear showed him The Truth Betrayed. Shortly after Cooper had seen the film for the first time, he accompanied John Lear for a joint interview on George Knapp's local Las Vegas TV show, and Cooper stunned Lear by claiming on air that he'd been told of the limo driver's involvement in the Kennedy assassination way back in the early 70s during his supposed top-secret briefings. In Cooper's book, Behold a Pale Horse, Cooper admits that he first obtained the alternate Zapruder tape from Lars Hansen via John Lear, but his story is predictably wildly divergent from Hansen's and Ecker's. I don't think Cooper's version is worth covering in detail here. If you want to read that section, you can find copies of the book online pretty easily, but it appears to be full of Cooper's typical self-mythologizing, implying that Hansen had obtained the film from some kind of secret CIA back channel, and claiming he'd been searching for the tape for some 16 years before finally discovering Hansen's copy. Cooper also acknowledges Hansen as the source of the footage in his recorded comments on his bootleg version of the tape. Cooper didn't even remove Hansen's voiceover from the section showing the high-contrast black and white version, which is still clearly audible on the tape Cooper released. And there's no real disagreement that Hansen had social and professional connections with multiple people in John Lear's circle, including Bill Cooper, Ted Gunderson, Michael Riconosciuto, Robert Booth Nicholls, and Lear himself. Remember, Hansen was even the source for Ken Thomas's Steam Shovel Press article covering Gunderson's connections to Nicholls and Riconosciuto. But why would these guys so readily attach themselves to a theory that seems so ludicrous on its face? Why would they try to pin the assassination on the limo driver, of all people, when there's so much negative evidence pointing away from that conclusion? Well, it probably has something to do with the state of JFK assassination research in the late 80s and early 90s. You have to imagine, this is well before widespread adoption of the internet, much less high-speed internet, so you couldn't just pull up a copy of the Zapruder film whenever you wanted. And what's more, the Zapruder tape was subject to some very strange copyright restrictions, where Abraham Zapruder's family controlled how and where the film was reproduced, making public airing of the footage expensive and rare. By the mid-'80s, when The Truth Betrayed was created, obtaining a personal copy of the Zapruder tape meant buying a copy from the U.S. National Archives, which is where Hansen said he got the source material, or paying one of the handful of private researchers offering their own reprints. In practical terms, this meant that the only copies available were third, fourth, or higher generation, and typically in the hands of hobbyists or JFK obsessives. The average person just hadn't seen the Zapruder film that often, and wouldn't even know where to get a copy. But more importantly, the theory would have seemed plausible because of how conspiracy theorists understood the second shooter problem. If you remember my last Robert Booth Nicholls video, there's a brief digression about how the Oliver Stone movie JFK had been released in December of 1991, just a few months before Nicholls' meeting with Sherry Seymour. And that movie contains a climactic scene during which New Orleans DA Jim Garrison plays the Zapruder film for the jury during Clay Shaw's trial.
The car breaks. The sixth and fatal shot, frame 313, takes Kennedy in the head from the front. This is the key shot. President going back and to his left. Shot from the front and right. Totally inconsistent with the shot from the depository. Again, back to the left. Back and to the left. Back and to the left.
Garrison is focusing on the movement of Kennedy's head here because according to the official story, Oswald shot JFK from the window of the Texas Schoolbook Depository, meaning the headshot came from behind Kennedy. Intuitively, it seems like the force of a bullet coming toward the back of Kennedy's head would push his head forward with the trajectory of the bullet. The fact that the Zapruder film shows Kennedy's head moving not forward, but back and to the left, suggests that the fatal headshot couldn't have come from the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and there must have been a second shooter somewhere in front of Kennedy. But as it turns out, our intuition is just wrong here.
The 1-inch wide tape is the skull for our melon. Dr. Louis explained that a bullet penetrating a skull doesn't transfer much of its energy to the head. It's a tiny hole, slides right in. The brain doesn't present much resistance, and when the bullet pops out the other side, it pulls a lot of brain, or in this case, melon goo, with it. The bullet and goo make a little jet blast that pushes the melon head in the opposite direction. Watch. The bullet and goo make a little jet blast that pushes the melon head in the opposite direction.
Obviously, there are many variables at play when it comes to the physics of a bullet entering a skull, but it is absolutely clear that there are conditions where a headshot from behind would cause the head to move toward the direction the bullet came from, rather than away from it. This head movement argument had been a common talking point in JFK conspiracy circles ever since Jim Garrison used it in the real-life trial of Clay Shaw. And Oliver Stone famously personally consulted multiple well-known conspiracy researchers while writing the script for JFK. Virtually all of the hypotheses about a second gunman in Dealey Plaza, from CIA agents on the grassy knoll to mobsters popping out of sewer drains, place the shooter in front of Kennedy rather than behind, in part because this theory about Kennedy's head movement held such sway in conspiracy circles. So what does this mean for Robert Booth Nicholls and the Octopus story more generally? In reality, probably not much. We already knew that Nicholls was a con man. Just look at his involvement in the Sam Israel case. And we knew that Nicholls was aware of conspiracy culture and interacted with some of its leading lights of the 1990s, like Ted Gunderson. But Nicholls also liked to play up this man of mystery angle about himself and imply that he had access to some secret, inside information. In some cases, this was clearly true. Nicholls really did traffic arms for the National Security Council and really did have contacts at the height of organized crime and American intelligence. Those Italian villas and French chateaus he owned didn't pay for themselves, but this circle surrounding John Lear had this property, which is by no means unique in the conspiracy world, where they were constantly coming up with new ways to make themselves characters in the conspiracy theory narratives they promoted. Bill Cooper couldn't admit that he just came across an interesting edit of the Zapruder film. Instead, he told people that he'd seen classified info proving the JFK conspiracy, and then a CIA agent leaked the real Zapruder film to him. John Lear couldn't say he heard a rumor on a UFO message board. No, it was always his sources deep inside the US government leaking to him that an alien invasion was imminent or whatever. The fact that Bob Lazar was a direct product of this scene isn't exactly surprising either. Ted Gunderson, Michael Riconosciuto, and Robert Booth Nicholls all seem to have indulged in this same kind of self-mythologizing. This isn't to say that the octopus wasn't real necessarily, or that Danny Casalero's work was useless. He was investigating actual scandals and corruption that really was widespread and deeply entrenched. But his work needs to be understood in the context of this larger conspiracy ecosystem of the era and some of the shady characters who were feeding him leads. And the game of telephone behind Robert Booth Nicholls' alternate Zapruder film represents in microcosm the logical errors, brain-dead credulity, and wishful thinking that still plagues conspiracy discourse to this day.